Syrian Arab Republic. Thank you very much, President. Tolstoy made a phrase famous, and I think it worth quoting today. Before casting judgment on others, you need to begin by judging yourself. Plato said that the crueler a lie is, the more easy it is to believe. President, having listened very carefully to the representative of the United States, it is my understanding that the Syrian government is understood to be responsible for genocide and crimes against humanity, at least in their eyes. It is my understanding, I beg your pardon, that the United States therefore must have committed similar crimes in Palestine, Vietnam, Rwanda, Nicaragua, and in the Great Lakes region. The government of the United States has been responsible for such actions, whether that be in Cuba, Venezuela, or the former Yugoslavia, or in Grenada. So I'd like to begin my statement by saying that my government is innocent of the charges of such crimes of having committed genocide. We will perhaps clarify our position in this statement or later, but we will make it very clear that we're innocent of the accusations leveled at us. President, certain members of this Security Council have, since the beginning of the terrorist war that has racked my country of Syria, have attempted to submit draft resolutions and called for emergency meetings, as is the case today. They wish to have emergency briefings on the basis of fallacious information and on false testimonies. And such briefings are called every time that the Syrian army and its allies make headway against the armed terrorist groups that are supported by the governments who call for these emergency briefings. These are not civilians, these are armed terrorist groups that we're waging war against. That situation, repeated so often in the past, is the same today. The highest official of this organization, the United Nations Secretary General, who has only 2 or 2.5 weeks to go before the end of his mandate, rushed in to make a statement on the situation on the city in Aleppo on the basis of unverified and unconfirmed information. And he himself admitted that the information was unconfirmed. He said himself that the United Nations was unable to independently verify the reports they were receiving. Those were his very words this morning. If the Secretary General is unable to verify the reports emerging from Aleppo, why then has he published this information and made this information public in his statement, as he did this morning, in an attempt to undermine the Syrian government and its allies in its fight against terrorism? I think we have every right to ask why the United Nations, which is supposed to be a source of credible information, is publishing declarations and statements and making judgments and findings on the basis of doubtful information. They can only be doing so if the goal of certain individuals in this organization is to serve the agendas of certain member states who are seeking to undermine and topple the Syrian government and to undermine its allies, and wish to give political and media coverage to the terrorist groups, painting them in the light which they do not deserve in order to serve their own interests. I would like to avow once again, President, to you, to the Security Council, and to those member states of the United Nations who still uphold international law and the Charter of the United Nations and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council on combating terrorism, that the actions of the Syrian government, and I repeat this point before you all, but our actions and those of our allies in Aleppo and across Syria are the expression of the constitutional and legal right of the government of the Syrian Arab Republic to protect its citizens against terrorism. This has guided our actions. We have taken such action all the time, abiding by international humanitarian and human rights law. I denounce and reject all fabricated reports used by the delegations of the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, as well as their partners and allies, which claim that the Syrian government is deliberately targeting civilians in Aleppo. I would like to reiterate that the actions of the Syrian government since the very outbreak of operations in Aleppo, whether that be the opening of a exit road to allow people to flee and to allow for the provision of aid, including shelters and medical aid and food. All the actions we've taken with regard to Aleppo have had the overarching goal of protecting civilians and of preserving life. Allow me, at this stage, to show you some photos that I have. This is what the Syrian army is doing in Aleppo. Here you see a picture of a Syrian soldier providing help and succor to a woman, helping her get out of a car. He is making his body a bridge so that this woman can get down or can get out of this vehicle. She's a woman fleeing eastern Aleppo. These are the humanitarian and self-sacrificing actions that we are engaged in, that the Syrian army is engaged in. Here you have a picture of another Syrian soldier who is carrying a civilian woman who is trying to flee the region, trying to flee the terrorists. He is seeking to carry her on his shoulders to help her on her way. Here you have an image of Syrian soldiers who are organizing the distribution of food aid to civilians after they've managed to flee eastern Aleppo. I have many other similar such photos, but I know that time is pressing. President, it is astounding that all of the reports of your Security Council speak to the presence of tens of thousands of terrorists and mercenaries, including FTFs in Syria, coming from more than 100 countries. That's a figure that was cited by the distinguished representative of Egypt. However, some, in order to protect their terrorists, reject the Syrian government's attempts to verify the identity of certain people leaving Aleppo, including previously terrorist-controlled areas of Aleppo. We wish to check their identity in order to ensure that they can't infiltrate other areas, to make sure they are not terrorists or foreign terrorist fighters seeking to carry out their nefarious actions in other parts of Syria, or indeed in other countries, including perhaps your countries. I have dozens of photos showing these terrorists, showing these individuals decapitating those who are seeking to flee eastern Aleppo, civilians seeking to flee eastern Aleppo. I also have pictures of these so-called heroes, the terrorist fighters, fleeing in the stream of civilians dressed as women to disguise themselves. They don women's clothing to flee eastern Aleppo in the ranks of the women and children fleeing eastern Aleppo, but because we've been able to carry these identity checks, the Syrian army has been able to find themselves. The highest hypocrisy is the attempt to judge and accuse the Syrian government on the basis of reports that have only been verified by the intelligence agencies of those calling for emergency meetings on Syria on the basis of unverified testimonies by civilians in eastern Aleppo. And these testimonies are then picked up, but we have counter testimonies. We have testimonies of civilians who talk about the practices of armed terrorist groups in eastern Aleppo, who talk about their suffering in eastern Aleppo. And these testimonies of what's really happening in Aleppo have been picked up by the media and by the press. I'm talking here not just about Arabic speakers. The height of hypocrisy, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that the delegates of those states who, on the basis of these erroneous reports, continue to repeat the lie that the Syrian government is besieging its own people and depriving them of medicine and food. And those same states that press that fallacious story deny the actual facts, the fact that terrorist groups have seized supplies in eastern Aleppo, that it is them who have pilfered food and medicine that was aimed at delivery to the civilian population. Why does that story go untold? How could a sensible individual believe for 1 minute that tens of thousands of terrorists that the Syrian army is fighting in eastern Aleppo have been able to carry out their terrorist acts for more than 4 years and survive, and to be able to continue to target infrastructure of the Syrian army and civilians without their sponsors, including some sponsors who are members of the Security Council, providing them with the supplies that they needed, including arms, weapons, and protection, as well as material supplies. President, I firmly and 100% reject the allegations put by certain members of the Security Council in this statement, talking about acts of revenge, summary execution, and terror waged against Syrian civilians by the Syrian government and its forces. As for our actions targeting terrorists, these are part of the prerogative of the Syrian government. It's exactly what you did in the streets of Nice, Paris, London, Boston, Oklahoma, and in North Carolina, as well as in Cairo and in Sinai, Tunis, Nigeria, Kenya, and many other countries, including, for example, Tanzania. You have also fought against and combated terrorism, and we have the right to do the same. Finally, President, I would like to say that it is surprising that the ambassador of the United Kingdom said that he doesn't believe that there are any terrorists in Aleppo, that no terrorism is being prosecuted there. We're talking here about a statement by a permanent member of the Security Council who, together with his colleagues, has contributed to the adoption of 16 resolutions on Syria. 8 of those 16 resolutions are resolutions on combating terrorism. Resolutions that were adopted because of the Syrian crisis. And all of those resolutions reaffirm the right of the government of the Syrian Arab Republic, together with your governments, to tackle terrorism, as you are doing in Iraq. We're able to do the same in Syria. So how can you then deny the presence of terrorism in Syria when the UK has voted in favour of 8 resolutions on counter-terrorism activities and combating terrorism? If I may make a correction, President, if you'll allow me, you said in your own statement, or rather you asked a question in your own statement, should we wait for the fall of Aleppo or the collapse of Aleppo? Allow me to correct you. This is not the fall of Aleppo, this is the liberation of Aleppo. The terrorists threatened the safety and security of the citizens of this city, and we are liberating and releasing them from that. Thank you very much.